All right, ready to dive into some Middle-earth.
Sounds good to me.
Today we're taking a deep dive into Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor.
Excellent choice.
We've got a treasure trove of German gaming reviews and articles to sift through.
And even a YouTube video review transcript, all in German, of course.
Yeah, naturally. And get this, the video focuses just on the first game.
While the articles tackle both the Shadow of Mordor and the sequel, Shadow of War.
Lots to unpack. So what's our mission for this deep dive?
I think it's to figure out what made these games tick, what got people so hyped up.
And do they actually live up to all that hype?
Exactly.
One thing that jumps out right away is all the praise both games got for their gameplay.
Especially Shadow of Mordor, the first one.
The Nemesis System, right?
You got it. That was a game changer.
When it first came out, gamers were losing their minds.
Yeah, no one had seen anything quite like it.
In most games, enemies are just kind of there.
They follow their programming, you beat them, end of story.
But the Nemesis System turned that whole idea upside down. So how does this revolutionary system work?
Well, each orc you encounter isn't just some random grunt.
Okay, so they're not just mindless enemies.
Right. They remember your fights, they actually hold grudges.
And they change based on what you do in the game.
Exactly. Say you beat one down. He might come back tougher, with a scar.
And a serious vendetta.
Oh, definitely.
Like building up a rivalry with these orcs.
Like in a good sports movie.
With a lot more head chopping, of course. But they're not just mindless killing machines, are they?
No, they develop personalities, strengths, weaknesses.
You might run into one that's totally terrified of fire.
Or another one, a total bruiser who just charges in head first.
Wild. I can see why the gaming world was so blown away by this.
It's not just fighting, it's more like you're crafting your own orc drama.
The YouTube reviewers seemed pretty impressed too.
He did.
Though he had some thoughts about the timing of unlocking the ability to control orcs.
Yeah, he thought it came a bit too late in the game.
Interesting. Timing is everything, huh? Especially with such a complex mechanic.
For sure.
We can't talk about the Nemesis System without mentioning its impact.
On the whole industry, yeah.
Even Ken Levine, the guy behind BioShock, was singing its praises.
Huge fan. He called Shadow of Mordor the first true open narrative game.
Whoa, that's a big statement and a really important distinction.
Right, it's not just an open world you can roam around in.
So it's more than just a big map to explore.
It's about your choices shaping the story that unfolds. The Nemesis System was the perfect example of that.
Okay, I'm hooked. Break down open narrative for me.
So think about it this way. Most open world games.
You might have different quest lines, maybe multiple endings.
Right, but the main story beats usually stay the same.
But with open narrative.
The narrative itself is always changing, based on how you play.
So you're not just playing through a story, you're creating it as you go along.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to combat either.
It affects everything.
Think about alliances, betrayals, those power struggles, all playing out differently based on how you interact with those orcs.
Wow.
And the sequel, Shadow of War, took it even further, letting you build entire armies.
And conquer fortresses.
Huge scale.
Ambitious. But one of the articles we read
Pointed out that the system in Shadow of War felt a bit more static.
yeah, less dynamic.
They said nothing really happens until you actively decide to go on a mission.
So it lost some of that organic, ever-changing feel of the first game.
Yeah, sometimes bigger isn't always better, right?
That classic trade-off.
Yeah.
Gaining that epic scale, but maybe losing some of that personal touch.
Right.
But all this talk about orcs in game systems.
Yeah.
What about the actual story?
We can't forget the story.
We're talking about Tolkien's world here, and that comes with some serious baggage.
It does.
How does a ranger with ghost powers fighting orcs in Mordor? How does that fit into all that established lore?
That's a good question. Both games follow this ranger named Talion.
Okay, Talion the Ranger.
And he's bound to the spirit of Celebrimbor,
Who is Celebrimbor?
an elf lord from way back.
Ah, so he's got this ghost buddy granting him superpowers. I'm picturing a supernatural buddy cop movie set in Mordor.
Pretty much. And they're on a revenge quest.
Against Sauron and his forces. Classic.
It is. And according to the reviewers, it all takes place between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
So it fits neatly into that timeline.
Sort of. One article mentioned that even though the developers worked with Middle-earth Enterprises and Weta Workshop,
So they had the official stamp of approval.
right, but there are still parts of the story that clash with Tolkien's original works.
So they took some creative liberties.
They did. I guess adapting a universe as rich as Middle-earth is a real balancing act.
Honoring the source material, but also bringing something new to the table. What did the reviewers think? Did the story hold up?
Well, it's a mixed bag. Some thought Shadow of Mordor's story was really gripping, with its dark personal tone.
In Shadow of War.
It seems the sequel's story was more divisive. Some liked the epic scale, the new characters. Others felt it lost the focus of the first game.
And fell into some predictable tropes.
Maybe. It seems trying to go bigger and more cinematic didn't work for everyone.
It's a risk. And there's one more thing that hurt Shadow of War in the eyes of the reviewers.
The microtransactions.
Yeah, those didn't go over well. Reviewers really hated how they disrupted the story's flow, especially towards the end.
Yeah, that can be frustrating.
Thankfully, they removed them after fans complained.
Yeah, always good to see developers listening to feedback.
It is. But let's shift gears. We've talked story and the Nemesis System. But what about the actual gameplay?
Right. What's it like to actually play these games?
Give us the rundown.
Think of it as Batman. Arkham meets Assassin's Creed.
But set in Mordor.
Exactly. You've got your combat, your stealth, your exploration.
Even some RPG elements thrown in.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The Arkham games had incredible combat. Did the reviewers think Shadow of Mordor lived up to that?
They did. They all praised how fluid the combat felt, how brutal it could be.
Satisfying them.
Totally. And they loved being able to chain attacks, counter enemies, and use those wraith powers for some really cool takedowns.
And the stealth. More than just hiding and stabbing orcs.
It is. You can use your powers to manipulate those enemies, dominate their minds, turn them against each other, even scare them into running away.
So you're not just a ranger, you're like a ghost-powered puppet master.
Exactly. You're playing mind games with them as much as you're fighting them. One article even talked about how the upgrade system in Shadow of Mordor makes stealth even more dynamic.
Cool. But besides all the cool mechanics, one thing that stood out to me was the world. Mordor.
Oh, yeah, they nailed it. The visuals, the sound design, it's all incredible.
The environments are breathtaking, bleak and desolate, yet somehow beautiful. They made Mordor a place you actually want to explore, even with all those orcs running around.
They really captured Tolkien's vision, and they didn't shy away from the darker, more unsettling parts of Mordor either, those spider-infested caves.
Don't remind me. And the sound just amplified everything. The music, the clash of steel, the roaring orcs, so visceral.
Completely immersive.
But no game is perfect. What were some of the flaws?
Especially with these games trying to do so much. Well, Shadow of War got some criticism for technical issues.
Uh-oh. What kind of issues?
Apparently there were performance problems on consoles, especially during those big battles.
Ambition bumping up against hardware limitations. A classic problem.
It is. But even with those hiccups, both Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War were incredibly ambitious games.
Definitely. They pushed the boundaries of what a licensed game could be, both in gameplay and storytelling.
They really did. And that's something worth celebrating. Even with their imperfections, they were bold and innovative.
And they left their mark on the industry.
A mark that's still felt today.
For sure. Well, I think that's a good place to pause for now. Join us next time as we delve even deeper.
Exploring their impact and legacy. It's going to be good.
Back again for more Shadow of Mordor.
Round 2.
Last time we were really getting into the stories of both games. Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War.
Right.
And it seemed like some reviewers weren't so happy with the sequel story. Like it lost some of that magic from the first game.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how each game approached Tolkien's world. Shadow of Mordor really leaned into those classic themes.
Revenge, power, corruption.
Exactly. All those things that really fit the tone of Tolkien's work.
But then Shadow of War went for something much bigger, didn't it? With those huge, almost cinematic battles.
It did. Almost like they were trying to capture that energy from the Lord of the Rings movies.
All those massive conflicts.
Right. But sometimes when you try to go for that kind of spectacle, you lose something.
You sacrifice a more character-driven story?
Maybe a bit. It's like they were trying to appeal to two different types of players.
With Shadow of Mordor, you get that deep, personal narrative.
And Shadow of War is for those who want to command armies and conquer fortresses.
Different strokes for different folks.
Exactly. But, one thing both games absolutely nailed was a presentation.
Oh, absolutely.
The visuals, the sound design, they really brought Mordor to life.
It was breathtaking, bleak and desolate, but also strangely beautiful. They made Mordor, dare I say, a place you actually wanted to explore.
I know, right? even with all those orcs running around.
Have they managed that?
They just captured Tolkien's vision so well. And they didn't shy away from the darker, more unsettling parts of Mordor either.
Like those creepy spider-infested caves.
Exactly.
And the sound design just amplified everything, didn't it?
Totally. The music, the clash of steel, the orcs roaring, it was all so visceral.
You could practically feel the impact of every blow.
For sure. Speaking of impact, let's get back to the gameplay.
Yeah, we talked about combat and stealth.
But what other fun stuff could players get into?
What made the gameplay so addictive?
Well, a huge part of it was the combat system. They took some ideas from games like Batman, Arkham, and Assassin's Creed.
But added their own unique spin to it. Those Arkham games were legendary for their combat. Did the Shadow games manage to live up to that?
Oh, they did. The reviewers were all raving about it.
Real?
Yeah. They loved how smooth the combat felt and how satisfying it was to string together those brutal combos.
And don't forget about the Wraith powers.
Oh, right. Using those to take down enemies was just so cool.
And we can't forget about stealth.
Oh, yeah, the stealth. That was way more than just hiding in the shadows. You could actually mess with the orcs' minds.
You could literally dominate them, turn them against their buddies.
You could even scare them into running away.
It was like having psychic superpowers.
It was. And like we talked about before, the upgrade system in Shadow of Mordor made stealth even more dynamic.
So you're not just a ranger, you're like a ghost-powered ninja with mind control.
That's one way to put it. And then, of course, Shadow of War took things even further with those massive fortress sieges.
Oh yeah, those were epic. You could build your own orc army, customize their gear, their abilities.
And then lead them into battle against those huge enemy fortresses. It was amazing.
It was like having your own personal warband.
It really was.
And it added a whole new layer of strategy to the game.
Didn't it? You had to really think about your army composition, plan your attack, and use your orc strengths to your advantage.
Sounds intense. But didn't some of those reviewers find the fortress sieges a little repetitive?
There were a few who felt that way.
Really?
Yeah, some people thought the sieges, while visually impressive, could get a bit predictable.
I can see that. Especially if every siege followed the same formula. It could get a little stale.
Right. To be fair, the developers did try to mix things up a bit.
In what way?
Well, you could choose from different types of orcs with unique skills.
So there was some variety there.
Yeah, and the layout of each fortress was procedurally generated, so it wasn't always the same.
Okay, so they tried to keep things interesting. But it sounds like the fortress sieges were one of those things that you either loved or found a bit tedious.
Pretty much. But even if those weren't your thing, there was still so much other great stuff in Shadow of War.
Like what?
The core gameplay was fantastic, the Nemesis system was still brilliant, and the presentation was top-notch.
All the things we've been raving about.
Exactly. And you know, something I really appreciated was the emphasis on player choice and freedom.
Oh, yeah, that was a big part of it.
You could really tailor your approach to combat, stealth, even army building to fit your own playstyle.
So you weren't forced into one specific way of playing.
Not at all. They created these incredibly dynamic worlds where you could experiment and find what worked best for you. Whether you wanted to be a stealthy assassin, a brutal warrior, or a cunning strategist, the games gave you the tools to do it.
It sounds like they really nailed that sandbox experience.
They did, giving players the freedom to forge their own path through Mordor.
It wasn't just about following a set story.
It was about making choices, shaping your destiny, and leaving your mark on the world.
Okay, so we've talked about the story, the gameplay, the visuals, the sound, the orcs.
We've covered a lot.
But what about the bigger picture? What kind of impact did these games have on the gaming industry?
That's the big question. It leads us into a fascinating discussion about legacy and influence.
Which we'll dive into when we return for the final part of our deep dive.
Can't wait.
All right, final part of our Shadow of Mordor deep dive.
Time to wrap things up.
We've talked story, gameplay, even those epic orc battles.
Pretty much everything.
But now for the big question, legacy. What mark did these games leave on the gaming world?
Well, even with their quirks, even those microtransactions, both games really pushed the boundaries. You can see their influence all over games that came after.
It all comes back to that Nemesis system, right?
I think so. It really was groundbreaking. Did other developers just copy it?
Well, not copy exactly.
But they were definitely inspired by it.
That whole idea of enemies remembering your actions, holding grudges, evolving over time, that became a hot thing in game design.
It's just so much more engaging than fighting the same generic bad guys over and over.
Right. Suddenly you've got this history with your enemies.
Every encounter means something.
So it wasn't just a cool gimmick. It actually changed how developers think about making games.
It did. Shows you the power of a truly innovative idea.
One game can change everything. Amazing. But the Nemesis system wasn't the only thing that had a lasting impact, was it?
Oh, no, definitely not. Think about that combat system. So free-flowing, all those counters, those stylish combos, a ton of action games that came after used that.
And the way they mixed stealth, action, RPG elements,
That's everywhere now.
like they created this perfect recipe that everyone's still using.
And it goes beyond just the mechanics, too. The Shadow games proved something really important.
What's that?
That licensed games don't have to be just cash grabs. They can be ambitious, innovative.
Expand on the source material in cool ways.
Exactly. These games didn't just rehash Tolkien's stories or characters. They built their own narratives, their own characters.
That felt both original and true to Tolkien's world.
They found that sweet spot, honoring the source, but also pushing the boundaries.
And they weren't afraid to get a little dark, were they?
No, they weren't. They explored those darker sides of Middle-earth.
The corrupting nature of power, the tough choices we face, really added depth to the experience.
And even though they stumbled a bit with those microtransactions in Shadow of War,
Yeah, that was
you
rough.
can tell the developers cared. They wanted to create something special.
They took some risks, and hey, not all of them paid off.
But it's that willingness to experiment that makes them so memorable.
So influential. Here's the big question, though.
What's that?
Will we ever see another game quite like them? Can anything top that Nemesis system?
I don't know. That's a tough one. It set a really high bar. I'm sure developers are still trying to figure out how to build on that.
Imagine a game where your choices not only change the enemies, but the whole world.
The possibilities are endless.
It's exciting. And it goes beyond just copying the Nemesis system.
Yeah.
It's about taking that core idea of dynamic gameplay, emergent gameplay, and just applying it to everything.
Environments that react to you, storylines that branch in crazy ways. Every playthrough totally unique.
That's what gets me excited for the future of gaming.
Me too.
But there's another challenge too, right?
What's that?
How do you stay true to the source material while still pushing the boundaries?
The Shadow games did a pretty good job with Tolkien's world.
They did. But it's a tough balancing act.
It is, especially when you're dealing with these huge franchises. But the Shadow games showed us it's possible.
Find that harmony.
Respect the source, but still bring something fresh to the table.
So the future of gaming is about finding that balance, taking risks, experimenting.
Couldn't agree more.
The Shadow games gave us a peek into what's possible. What happens when developers embrace innovation?
It's up to the next generation to take that and run with it.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been fun.
We covered a lot, but hopefully you learned something new, and maybe you'll go back and give these games another look.
They're worth it.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop diving deep.